right now, you're in for a treat. It's time for the main event.
All right, thank you very much. All right, well, our conference promoter, Mark Skousen, has been promoting tonight's event as the big fight, the big debate, and tonight's two opponents hardly need any introduction. In this corner, weighing in at a trim 144 pounds, Mr. Dinesh D'Souza. Mr. D'Souza is the Robert and Karen Rishwain Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and the author of many best-selling books, including What's So Great About Christianity. And in this corner, weighing in at a brawny 172 pounds, is Mr. Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and the Atlantic Monthly, and is also the author of many best-selling books, including God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Now, here is the format for this evening's debate. I'm going to give each of them 10 minutes to make their introductory argument. War, terrorism, and geopolitical crisis. Is religion the solution or the problem? They will each have 5 minutes then to rebut their opponent. Afterwards, I will ask each of them one question and give them 6 minutes to respond, and their opponent 6 minutes to rebut. For the remaining 45 minutes, we will be taking questions from the audience. So you can line up at the, I'll give you the signal, you can line up at the microphone in a little bit. In each case, our conference organizer, Tammy Holland, is going to notify them when they have 1 minute remaining of their time. Any questions about the ground rules? No? Okay. Chip mentioned a couple of ground rules. Here they are. All right? The two of tonight's debaters, please. No headbutts, no ear pulling, no slapping, no biting, no gagging, no eye gouging, no spine locks, no neck cranks, no faking an injury, no escaping the ring, no hair pulling, no fish hooking, no distracting the referee, no groin strikes, no toe locks, no grabbing the throat, no attacks to the windpipe, no punches to the head, no hitting below the belt, and no unsportsmanlike conduct. So, in that case, why don't we begin with Mr. Hitchens.
Sorry, I wasn't ready. I thought I was going to go second. Listen, Dinesh and I have been around this block before, as probably some of you already know, and sometimes we discuss and debate whether or not there is a historical truth to religion. In other words, did any of this stuff ever happen? Was a Redeemer ever sent to us? If so, was his mother a virgin? If so, was she immaculately conceived? If so, what took so long? Questions of this kind that are not at all without their importance and their validity. And sometimes we discuss what you might call the metaphysical truth of it. Is there redemption to be had in this way? Is it conceivable as you stand at Las Vegas airport tomorrow, perhaps, and watch people go by and play the game that I play, and imagine which primate, what kind of primate would they be if they were covered in fur? Would this be an orangutan? Would that be a gorilla? Would that be a mandrill, and so on? And so you can always tell. And then say, yes, but if that one there had made the right propitiations, had gone to the right prayer meetings, had made the right offertories, had sworn to the right oaths, that one would have eternal life, and the others would not. And see if you can make yourself believe any of that for a second. That would be a very good debate. And we've had that debate too, and we expect to have it many times in the future. Today, we're only discussing, and we've only got time to discuss one thing, which is our third and fallback debate. Does this stuff, even if it's all bullshit, even if it's all made up, even if it's all entirely man-invented, does it at least make people behave better? It may not be true. It may indeed be completely false. It may be fabricated, but does it have a moral effect? Does it make people treat each other more kindly? Okay? That goes nowhere near the metaphysical and the moral truth of the matter. In other words, as Lady Bracknell is supposed to have said, I don't care what people do as long as they don't in the street and frighten the horses. And if a good preaching will stop them doing that, then so much the better for preachments. So we look around today's world, and I've got now not very many minutes left, and I'll tell you why I don't think there's any evidence at all, to make us believe that true or false religion is better in times of crisis, war, terrorism, famine, and so forth. And I'll start self-critically, if I may. There was a time when, as a secularist, atheist, socialist, I was not a close friend, but a bit of a friend of Robert Mugabe. He was then the leader of a guerrilla movement in what was then southern Rhodesia, a British-ruled white settler colony in South Central Africa, had been part of the Central African Federation. He was trying to lead a movement to overthrow white settler colonial rule. I was somewhat on his side. I used to go and interview him. I would introduce him to other journalists. I would write articles that I somewhat blush to remember now in his favor. And I know why I was doing it. I know what I was doing. But you can perhaps picture, having read the papers recently, the embarrassment I would now be feeling at having recommended this guy. And I was looking at the records and the reports from Zimbabwe, as it's now called. Have been doing this all year. I feel I'm obliged to do it. I've been back a few times too, and seeing how absolutely hellish he's made the life of his people. And I was looking at the record of the Bishop of Bulawayo, the second city of Zimbabwe after Harare, the Catholic bishop, Pius Nkube, who had made a very brave stand against Robert Mugabe, who is, as you know, himself a very believing Catholic, and who has twice been allowed into Europe, in spite of the European Union's ban on his presence on European soil, because the Vatican keeps on inviting and allowing Robert Mugabe to come to Western Europe, in spite of the obviously insanitary consequences of his being allowed out of his cage. And Pius Nkube, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Bulawayo, having made a very brave moral and physical resistance to this ghastly dictatorship, was recently framed up in an affair with his housekeeper. By saying he was framed up, I don't mean to say he wasn't having an affair with his housekeeper. Some of you may be relieved to know that his housekeeper was female. It's nice to have a heterosexual scandal in the Roman Catholic Church every now and then. And I dare say he didn't have to be tempted all that much. I mean to say the frame-up was the videoing of it by Robert Mugabe's secret police, the transmission of this on primetime on Zimbabwe TV, the ghastliness of the way in which this setup was conducted. And Pius Nkube goes. The Vatican says, that's it. You're no longer the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Bulawayo. You have to go. You've gone too far. Robert Mugabe, the communicant, the daily Catholic communicant who thanks God for his electoral victory, which you may have seen recently, celebrated so warmly by his people, has not been forbidden the sacraments, hasn't been excommunicated, Now, Pius Nkube, the Bishop of Bulawayo, had an affair with his housekeeper. Robert Mugabe has subjected his entire country to torture, famine, theft, expropriation, death squads, and the rest. But it seems to me there's nothing he can do to get himself outside the church. He'd probably have to recommend condoms or abortions at the rate he's going, before anything would be said about him, any condemnation would be thundered from the pulpit. Now, I ask you, what does this make one conclude about whether or not religion, in its organized or informal shape, has the propensity to make people behave better or otherwise? And you will notice, I hope, that I've picked as my counterexample a Catholic bishop, and I've picked as my first example someone who, when I first knew him, I believed to be a secularist. So I hope you won't think I've picked a soft or easy target. Let me move on a little, just since we're doing a tour d'horizon of our troubled globe at present. Not everyone notices this, but I do. the recent recrudescence of something very sinister and very menacing, that is to say, despotism of the old form in Russia, one-party rule, KGB rules, KGB standards for the treatment of dissent, for the treatment of the press, for the treatment of opposition politicians, for the treatment of neighboring countries as far distant as Georgia and Chechnya and Latvia and Lithuania. The return, in other words, of what used to be called Great Russian chauvinism under Putin and Medvedev is accompanied by something that was always the accompaniment of Great Russian Tsarist tyranny and, by the way, Stalinist tyranny before. Over the shoulder of the dictator stands, every time you see it, the black cowled figure of the Russian Orthodox bishop, claiming, as they do now, and as they're freely granted by Putin and Medvedev, exclusive right to be the state church. No other Christian church is allowed even to recruit or proselytize in Russia, let alone a Jewish or Islamic force. Not allowed at all. When Medvedev takes his oath of office as president, he takes it with an archbishop holding an icon up for him to kiss. You may remember that in the very strong field of stupid remarks made by President Bush, probably the stupidest, this is a very competitive selection, was his meeting with Vladimir Putin, where he said, as soon as he saw that he was wearing his grandmother's crucifix, he could look into his eyes and know that he was a sincere and decent man. Doesn't anyone here feel a moan of shame that any American president could make such a statement and be so uncritically received for it? Because to use the word faith is always to use the word as if it was a positive. And see what we've helped to baptize in Russia now, another form of Tsarism, anti-Semitism, chauvinism, police dictatorship, with baptizing it, the Russian Orthodox Church. This is a decision with which we will feel a strong sense of dissent and regret and remorse for many years to come in my submission. And it's impossible to imagine this new form of Russian tyranny without this Christian carapace overlaid upon it. Need I add to an audience as well versed in current affairs as this one, that a nightmare that has been obsessing all thinking people for many decades now is about to be upon us. We've all worried and wondered when it would occur. When will it happen that a messianic regime or gang or group will manage to get hold of apocalyptic weaponry? When will the two curves intersect? When will those who think that the end of the world is coming get weaponry that can make that happen? Well, it is about to happen in Iran, in Persia. You can wave all you like, darling, I can't see it. How many minutes is that? 1 minute. I've barely got my trousers off and she's already calling time. Well, let me not then adumbrate too much. It's going to happen. It has, in fact, almost certainly already occurred. The parties of God intend to confront us with the idea of how we'll feel when we have to live at their pleasure, when we in the United States and our friends and allies in Western and Eastern and Central Europe and Lebanon and the Sunni Arab Gulf and also will have to wonder all the time, what is the pleasure? What is the pleasure of the Iranian theocracy now that it has thermonuclear weapons and the means to deliver them? We will have to factor their desires into our arrangements. We will have to know what it's like to live at their pleasure. And I think if I phrase it like that, I won't need to unsheath from their quiver the rest of my examples. That is why I say in my book, and that's why I say in all my, that the origins of totalitarianism are theocratic, that the original totalitarian temptation, the original totalitarian proposition is that we can refer all our difficulties, all our wishes, all our desires, all our hopes, all our dreads and fears to an unalterable dictatorship, a celestial North Korea in the sky that supervises us from dawn till dusk, that subjects us to constant surveillance while we're asleep, before we are born, after we are dead, and that not until we can get rid of this diseased desire for dictatorship, this hatred of our own freedom, this wish for tyranny in our own heads, do we stand the smallest chance of emancipating ourselves, our children, our allies, our friends, our comrades, and our descendants from the horror, the hell of dictatorship and mass murder in the here and now. I rest my case. Thank you.
It's for me always a much anticipated event to come back to Freedom Fest. I'm delighted to be sharing the podium with Christopher. As usual, his opening statement is very sneaky. Rather than make the argument in the form I anticipated, he kind of has launched the elliptical mode of attack. I'm going to come back to some of the things he spoke about. I want to address the atheist argument, you may say, in its more mainstream form. And in its more mainstream form, the kind that we see in books like God is Not Great, or The God Delusion, The End of Faith, and so on, has essentially been to say that if you look around the world, you see religion as the source of the problem. You got the Islamic crazies over there. You got the Christian nuts over here. What do these groups have in common? Well, they're fueling their fanaticism at the same holy gas station. In other words, religion is the problem. And it doesn't stop there. One of the atheist writers very cleverly described 9/11 as, quote, a faith-based initiative. And you see, I'm following here the principles of the just war. Rather than gouge the opponent, I state his argument very eloquently, even causing my opponents to applaud. Then I gracefully knock them down. Well, to return to the point at hand. The argument goes on. Look around the world. What's the source of tension, conflict, division, violence? The Israelis and the Palestinians are fighting over religion. The Shia and the Sunni in Iraq. The Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. And history tells the Crusades, the Inquisition, the religious wars, the witch trials. So, the argument goes, a reasonable person would conclude that we'd be a lot better off if we got God out of it, if we had a secular society. It would be a more reasonable, more scientific, more peaceful, more decent society. This is the argument I want to take on. In other words, the new atheism not at its weak point, but in some ways at its strong point. And like a lot of arguments that at the end of the day I want to argue is bogus or specious, it does contain an element of truth. When I speak on the university campus, I often tell students, when you hear an argument that's flawed, always ask what is the grain of truth in it. Because if it didn't have a grain of truth, no one would believe it. So there is a molecule of truth in what Christopher is arguing. It is true that the Islamic radicals do what they do in the name of God. But here is where the bogus analogies set in. There is an effort here, for example, to equate Islamic radicalism over there with, say, Christianity. Now, first of all, let's ask in a very reasonable way, who is the Christian bin Laden? Where is the Christian Al-Qaeda? Where is the Christian Hamas or Hezbollah? Where is the Christian country today, run along the lines of Khomeini's Iran? I don't know if you saw Christiane Amanpour's special, God's Warriors, which attempted to make this sort of analogy between Islam and Christianity. You know, the first day was Islam, and so we heard about 9/11, the Bali bombing, the London bombing, the Madrid bombing, and so on. But when it came to Christianity, it was something more like this. Here is Christiane Amanpour in the hills of Montana. Outside a trailer sits an 80-year-old man in a rocking chair. He wants to blow up the world. He's the Christian bin Laden. True, he doesn't have a dollar to his name, but be very afraid of this guy. So this is what I'm getting at. The crimes of radical Islam could not be reasonably imputed to any other religion, not Hinduism, not Buddhism, but this false equation has enabled the new atheist to get quite a bit of mileage. Now I turn to the rest of the world and I ask this question: is it really true that these conflicts around the world are driven by religion? What are the Israelis and the Palestinians fighting about? Are they fighting about God? Are the Israelis saying, you know what, we think Moses was the greater prophet? The Palestinians go, no, we're Muslims, we think it was Muhammad, and they come to blows. Is that what those guys are fighting about? No. They are in fact fighting about land. And similarly, the Hindus and the Muslims are fighting over Kashmir. And similarly, in Northern Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants are not fighting about the Eucharist or transubstantiation. They are fighting over which group of guys gets to rule that country. Self-determination is the issue. There's a story about a guy in Belfast. He's walking on the street. A man jumps behind him and puts a gun to his head and says, Catholic or Protestant? And the man says, actually, I'm an atheist. And the voice behind him says, Catholic atheist or Protestant atheist? And the point of the story is religion is not fundamentally what's at issue. Now, I don't want to look at history. I'll come back to that. But I do want to say that while we hear a lot of incredible crocodile tears about the crimes of religion, crimes, by the way, that are often in the very ancient past, the Crusades 1,000 years ago, the Inquisition 500 years ago. If you read Henry Kamen's multi-volume study of the Inquisition, he's the leading living scholar of the subject, he points out that the Spanish Inquisition, over a period of 350 years, killed approximately 2,000 people. 2,000 people, 350 years. I'm not a math major, but it works out to about 6 guys a year. Not exactly a world historical crime by any standard. By contrast, not only the crimes of Christianity, but even the crimes of Islam pale when you consider the crimes of atheist regimes committed not in the ancient past, but in living memory in our lifetime, and they are still going on. Incidentally, I'm not just talking about Stalin in Russia or Mao in China or even the Nazi regime in Germany. Junior league atheists like Pol Pot. He doesn't make it into the top category normally. He's not even mentioned. Well, in Indochina, in the space of 3 years, he and his Khmer Rouge regime managed to kill about 2 million people. So what I'm getting at is that when you do any kind of a reasonable comparison, and by reasonable comparison, I mean if you want to hold the people who are acting in the name of God responsible for what they do in the name of God, in other words, if religion must take the blame for the crimes inflicted in the name of religion, let's be consistent and blame atheism for the crimes inflicted in the name of creating the atheist utopia and the secular paradise liberated from the shackles of traditional religion and traditional morality. So I want to make the argument now Richard Dawkins in his book The God Delusion jumps in here with an important qualification. He says, but wait a minute. The Christians killed in the name of Christianity. You might have had tyrants who happened to be atheist, but they didn't kill in the name of atheism. Now, Dawkins, as you know, is an accomplished biologist, but here I think you see the problem when a biologist is permitted to leave the lab. In other words, here is a guy with evidently no understanding of history. I mean, if you look, for example, at communist regimes, it is not an accident, as the Marxists like to say. It was part of the deliberate design of the regime. The whole idea is that religion, well, Marx in a complicated analysis called it the opiate of the masses, but what he really meant is religion functions as a kind of drug. It blinds you from social injustice. The true liberated society would get rid of it. And so it is not, as I say, coincidental. Every Marxist regime has targeted the churches, persecuted the priests, killed the believers, and so on. The atheism isn't incidental. It is part of the conceptual scheme from the beginning. Finally, I want to make this point, and that is that we're fighting a war on terror. I have 1 minute, I see. We're fighting a war on terror, and I ask this question. what is the best way to fight it effectively? I think this is an area where Christopher Hitchens and I are in agreement, which is to say that our mode of communication with the radical Muslims should not be in the form of a pleasant conversation and shared cocktails, but rather in the form of live ammunition. So where is the fortitude to take on radical Islam coming from? Is it going to come from secular Europe? Or is it going to come from a more muscular and a more religious United States? The Europeans so far have proved, well, let me just say that the Swedes recently upgraded their terror alert from run to hide. So Hitchens, I think, is about the only pugnacious secularist we have. So if we're looking for fighting the kind of theocratic menace that he sees on the horizon, I ask him, is it not a paradox, perhaps a tragic paradox, that at the end of the day, it's going to be the Christians who head to Iraq and the secular guys who come to Vegas? Thank you very much.
With your permission, I'll take Dinesh's points in, so to say, reverse order. The last one will be reverberating in your heads the loudest, I dare say. It was not I, the atheist, but Archbishop Rowan Williams, the head of the Anglican and Episcopalian Communion, who recently demanded that Britain adopt Sharia law, at least for its Muslim population, rather than face any more threats of terrorism or the inconveniencing of Islamic propagation and promulgation of extremist ideas. Now, I regard that as not an accidental concession on the part of a spiritual leader of the West. I regard it as first, very suggestive, and second, almost inevitable. There is something, to me at any rate, I'll simply have to state it, masochistic about Christianity. It wallows in guilt. It believes its adherents to be guilty from before they were born of original sin. If someone despises it, it looks for the reason why that contempt might be justified. And it proposes the hideous, the disgusting, the contemptible, the revolting, the dangerous, the suicidal idea, which everyone in this room must teach themselves to repudiate, that we should love our enemies. This is an obscene conceit. Dr. Rowan Williams, who does the most perfect impersonation of a Welsh sheep I have ever seen, can go love his own f***ing enemies. I don't want him loving mine. I don't want him telling me that I must learn to adore the misunderstood Al-Qaeda sympathizer. I don't want him saying in the name of his contemptible Nazarene ideology that I must give up my freedom, that the rule of law in the country of my birth is over, that there's a separate law for people of a separate religion, that we are not all governed by the same courts, not all by the same understanding, that anyone with a different faith can claim a different jurisdiction. That is moral and political and cultural suicide, and not to call it Christian would be to miss the point. Now, there are those who say that Buddhism is not really a religion, and I know that Buddha is not considered by his fans to be exactly a god. He was born out of a slit in his mother's side, which makes me suspicious. You notice how most religions seem to think of the birth canal as a one-way street. Something they abhor about the female genitalia. It puts me on my guard. All right, let them not say it's a religion. It's faith-based to me. It stinks of that. Burma, the Burmese military dictatorship, is a Buddhist dictatorship. It stays in power by building itself bigger and bigger pagodas in its own name and asking its luckless inhabitants and subjects to identify it, the anonymous military camarilla, with the precepts of Buddhism, which include the terrible, immoral doctrines of fatalism, surrender, reincarnation, and the idea that those who suffer in this life are being punished for the sins of a previous one. Okay, some brave Buddhists also oppose this dictatorship, but on no basis that one can understand except a rivalry within a certain cult. I've been to North Korea, the most perfected, the most perfected totalitarian system, probably in the history of the world. I've actually been to all the axis of evil countries, but North Korea, as you may know, is run currently by someone who's only known as Mr. Chairman, Kim Jong-il. He can't be called Mr. President because his father, Kim Il-sung, is still the president of North Korea. He's been dead for 10 years, which makes North Korea into what I call a necrocracy, or a thanatocracy, or a mausolocracy, but he's still the president. Kim Jong-il is only head of the party and the army, not of the state. You notice this, and he's considered to be a reincarnation of his father. You notice this leaves North Korea one short of a trinity. This is not an atheist state. It's the most worshipful and religious country I have ever seen. When I was young, I used to wonder, when they told me what hell was like, I could believe it. When they told me what heaven was like, eternal praise. You get to sing the praises of God forever, every day, all the time, round the clock, forever. Not just for the rest of your life, forever. That's heaven. Sounds like hell to me, but I still couldn't actually imagine it. Now I've been to North Korea, I've seen it happen. That is your only right. Your only right as a North Korean is to sing the praises of the eternal, thankful, beautiful, brilliant leader for all time. Don't let Dinesh or anyone else fool you by saying that that is secularism. I've got a minute, right? Well, then let me squander it with just some vulgar knockabout. You might not have thought this election, this our great republic, the United States, was being fought to a very, very high standard from the start, and nor it was. But if you've noticed, every one of the cheapest and nastiest moments in this campaign, from both sides of those seeking not just the nomination but the presidency, has been inflicted upon us by a clergyman. All the low moments in this are the greatest secular, constitutional republic, the only country on earth with a secular constitution, the only one that has a constitution that doesn't mention the word God, anyway, and by design, has been subjected to a consistent attempt to degrade the political process by people who prove that anything is permissible to any thug, any bore, any demagogue, any racist, any creep who can get the word reverend put in front of his name. Whether it's Jeremiah Wright or Hagee or my favorite, the Reverend Rod Parsley. Sounds like a P.G. Woodhouse character on a bad day. One of McCain's advisors who says that the mission of the United States is to have a holy war with Islam. In other words, don't, as we have been up till now, don't confine your apprehension, ladies and gentlemen, of this threat to in partibus infidelium, to those countries far away on the horizon and far out of our immediate ken, where barbarism and superstition reigns. Bear in mind that this nonsense, this idiocy, this evil, this wickedness is coming soon to a place near you too, and get ready to resist it while you still can. Thank you.
Perhaps I'll begin by talking a little bit about the Archbishop Rowan Williams and Sharia. Somebody asked me the other day on a campus, what do you think should happen to him, the Archbishop? And I said, well, I think he should be horsewhipped. And the student said, but didn't Christ say you should turn the other cheek? And I said, yes, but the Archbishop Rowan Williams wants Sharia. Let's give it to him. So here, my point is this. If you actually look at what Rowan Williams was arguing, he was actually not saying that in the imitation of Christ, let's extend a forgiving hand and a welcoming hand to the Muslims. Rather, he was making an argument drawn from secular liberal multiculturalism. He was saying something not very different than you'd hear today on a university campus from a sociologist at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst who has never set foot in a synagogue or church, but who would argue something like this. Because the West no longer believes in Christianity, we now believe in nothing. In other words, you'll often hear people say, what we have in common is our diversity, which is another way of saying that as Americans we have nothing in common. What we have in common is what distinguishes us. And since that is the case, the only rational rule is to give everybody equal access to the public square. And that includes the secular guy, but it includes the believer. And if it includes both, surely it cannot exclude the Muslim. And so what I'm getting at here is it is precisely not a religious argument, but the collapse of the religious foundation of Western civilization that has opened the door to a certain kind of, you may say, namby-pamby version of tolerance. The Christians, by the way, have a version of tolerance. It's a little bit of a stricter version. In fact, think about the word tolerance. Tolerance contains the seeds of disagreement, if not contempt. If I say I tolerate you, it means you stink. You suck. I detest your principles. That's why I have to put up with you. If I agreed with your principles, there would never be a question of tolerance. So what we have now is a subtle shift from, you might say, Christian tolerance, which retains the idea of identity and truth, and secular liberal tolerance, which dispenses with it. Now let me talk a little bit about totalitarianism. I want to read you a line from the atheist Daniel Dennett in his book Breaking the Spell, is looking at this issue of religion and atheism. And he says this debate is getting a little bit too far out. Let's establish some clear rules. And the clear rule he establishes is the one drawn from the Bible, by their fruits ye shall know them. Now I'm going to quote Dennett. He says, "It is true that religious fanatics are rarely, if ever, inspired or guided by the deepest and best tenets in those religions." And then he says this, "So what? Al-Qaeda and Hamas terrorism is still Islam's responsibility, and abortion clinic bombing is still Christianity's responsibility." Here's what he's saying. The ordinary Muslim doesn't get to say, I'm a peace-loving guy because of really bad things that are being done in the name of Islam. He or she bears some of the responsibility for that. And similarly, the ordinary peace-loving Christian has got to answer to some degree for the Inquisition and the Crusades and so on. Fair enough. If that's the standard, it's got to be applied equitably. What we have here is Christopher Hitchens essentially attempting a kind of, you may say, very stylish sleight of hand. He's basically saying, let's blame religion for the crimes of religion, and then let's take all the things done by atheist regimes in the name of atheism and also blame them on religion. Because after all, isn't it true that when you look at these atheist regimes, they kind of sort of resemble theocratic regimes? So what we're getting here ultimately, I think, is a dodge. If we're going to hold, if the ordinary Christian is responsible for what the Christians did, then the peace-loving atheist doesn't get to wriggle out from under the things that have been done in the name of creating the secular utopia. The 20th century was really an attempt to create secular utopia. It's failed miserably. So the one great experiment of secularism, of creating the religion-free society, has been terrible. Now you might say, well, what about the West? What about Europe? Remember that Europe and America, even in our secular moments, are still affirming principles that are part of our Judeo-Christian legacy. This is a point to which I will soon return. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask one question and give Dinesh a chance to answer it, and then Christopher a chance to rebut his remarks. And then we're going to go ahead and open up the floor to questions after that. Now, this is a libertarian conference, and libertarians often argue from first principles. And so my question for Dinesh is, in your book, you claim that there is historical evidence to believe that Jesus of Nazareth lived a couple of millennia ago, that he actually performed the acts that are described in the gospel, and that even though historians would say that evidence for the life of Jesus and what he did outside of the gospel is scant. So does this evidence truly exist, and if it does, where are we to find it?
To me, one of the really interesting aspects of this religious debate is that in looking at the claims of religion, Christianity in this case, we often apply a standard that we don't apply to anyone else. So, for example, in God is Not Great, Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens says, we don't even know if Christ even existed. He could have been a myth. And your question returns to that point. Now let me answer that question in a little different way. How do we know that Socrates existed? You can't go into a philosophy classroom in America or perhaps in the world and find a serious philosopher who doubts the existence of Socrates. And yet the truth of it is, the sources for Socrates are only two, Plato and Xenophon. And both are admiring worshippers of Socrates. Both are disciples, if you will, of Socrates, and they give contradictory pictures of him. Nevertheless, it is the unanimous conclusion of the philosophy departments of America that Socrates was a real guy. He really did walk the streets of Athens. Now, how do we know that Alexander the Great existed? My point is, when you look at the sources for the ancient world, in almost every case they are extremely scanty. The sources are very often dated to hundreds of years after the events that were described, and yet the historical assumption is we believe it to be true unless we have strong evidence to the contrary. If someone is digging up ancient archaeological remains in Egypt, you find the tomb of Tutankhamun with some writing on it, you believe that this is authentic unless you have reason to believe that somebody forged it. Only when it comes to Christianity, by the way, when you look at the gospel manuscripts, they are multiple. There are actually hundreds and hundreds of the reliability and authenticity of biblical manuscripts is far greater than any other document in the ancient world. The sources for the historicity of Christ are not limited to the four gospels. There are Jewish sources, Josephus. There are Greek sources, there are Roman sources. At one point, Tacitus, no admirer of Christianity, says there's a big hubbub going on somewhere in the outskirts of the empire. This crazy guy named Christus is causing the ruckus. Fortunately, the guy was crucified before he caused too much trouble. I'm saying this is the kind of evidence that in any other case would be, without a blink, accepted as legitimate. But because it is Christianity, the academic prejudice kicks in, the bar is lifted, and a different standard or compass is being applied. Notice I'm making no argument based on the Bible or Revelation. I'm simply calling for an even-handed application of scholarly and historical evidence. Now I'll consider very briefly the resurrection, which is the central miracle of Christianity. Here's the interesting historical fact. Christ is crucified. That's not so strongly argued about. Christ is buried, put in a tomb, and a stone is supposedly put in front of the tomb, and Roman guards are guarding it. Now, for 300 years or more, in the early Christian polemics between the Christians and the Jews asserted that the disciples stole the body. The disciples came and took Jesus' body. Interestingly, the Jews didn't say Christ was not crucified. They didn't say that the tomb wasn't empty. They admitted those things, but they claimed that the disciples must have somehow conned the Roman guards or rolled the stone away and stolen the body. Anyway, here's the point I want to get at. You've got these early disciples, and by the biblical accounts themselves, Christ is dead. They are dejected, feeling kind of low, you might say. And then something happens. something rather weird happens, and this group of ragtag guys, relatively uneducated, and a relatively small group, suddenly becomes convinced that they have actually seen Christ. Not one or two guys, but many. And at one point, Paul refers to 500 witnesses, many of whom are still alive, although some, he says, have passed away. He's writing, by the way, within the 30 to 40 years after Christ. In other words, at a time when many people, if they disagreed with him, could have stood up and contested his account. Here's the point I'm getting at. These Christians then launched the largest conversion wave ever known to history. The only competition would perhaps be the spread of Islam in the desert 700 years later. But nevertheless, the Christians go from about 50 at the time of Christ's death to really a majority in the Roman Empire. The majority of Roman citizens were Christian before Constantine converted in the 4th century. Now you might say, well, maybe they just believed a lie. But then you've got to remember that the Romans put many of these people to death for what they believed, raising an interesting question. Someone can believe a lie, or even wish for a lie, but why would someone die for a lie? Now you might say, well, the Muslims do. They want the 72 virgins in heaven. They're dying for a lie, but they don't know it's a lie. They're going to wake up in heaven and say, wait a minute, it's hot in here. But the point here is we're not talking about people expecting an unknown future reward. We're talking about people who would be dying for something they know not to be true. If one guy does it, he could be crazy. But when hundreds, thousands of people do it, it's a little bit like the debate about UFOs. People say, well, I can bring you 10 guys who say they saw UFOs. Well, you bring me 95% of human beings on the planet who saw UFOs, and I'll be looking for them myself. In other words, we live in a world where the vast majority of people not only believe in God, but claim to have some experience of Him. We're supposed to be libertarians, champions of realism, the real world, practical, empirical, valuing human experience. Is it really our position that the vast, vast majority of the world's people who we want to trust with freedom to use their money well and to organize their lives, but they are so deluded, these same people, that they are all living in the fantasy of something that simply doesn't exist? Why would such people not be better governed by some kind of a wise man who knows better? Freedom presumes that people are good judges of the validity of their own experience, that people are fairly reasonable about whether something is going to improve their life or not. That's why you trust them with their own money. That's why you trust them to meet and assemble and vote the way they do. So I'm arguing here that libertarianism at its deep level is based, I wouldn't say just on a Christian assumption, but I would say on the assumption that, on certain assumptions that we often ignore because they are underground. We are standing, if you will, on a political hill. We need to look at the ground below us. This idea that if I swing my fist, I should stop at your jaw. Why? If we are Darwinian primates, why? Show me someone in the animal kingdom that does that. I debated recently with Peter Singer about animal rights, and I told him the problem with animal rights is we can't get animals to respect animal rights. I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
That was terrible, Dinesh. Just before we stop on the virgin thing, if these poor fools had read the Talmud instead of the Quran, they'd know that they get 72 mothers-in-law as well. Look, Dinesh is correct in saying that in my book I say that there's no reason at all to believe that the so-called Jesus of Nazareth ever existed, but here's what I say about Socrates. The original collision between our reasoning faculties and any form of organized faith, this is my book, though it must have occurred before in the minds of many, is probably exemplified in the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. It does not matter at all to me that we have no absolute certainty that Socrates even existed. The records of his life and his words are second-hand, almost but not quite as much as are the books of the Jewish and Christian Bible and the hadiths of Islam. Philosophy, however, has no need of such demonstrations, because it does not deal in revealed wisdom. Now, as it happens, we do have some very good descriptions of the life of Socrates that make his existence to me plausible, but it doesn't matter to me at all whether he was real or not. What matters is that someone advanced his method of reasoning, his testing of evidence against experience, his commitment to a certain kind of dialectical honesty, and that if it hadn't been him, it would have been someone else. So that's what's precious to me. And that he never said, you've got to believe in everything I say, or go to hell or heaven. Because, and here's why you've got to agree with me, because my mother never went to bed with anybody. And that proves the truth of what I say. Or by the way, I must have looked very dead when they took me down from the cross, but I didn't die. And that proves my point. I'm willing to grant it all. I'm willing to grant the Immaculate Conception first, then the virgin birth, then the resurrection, and the Annunciation and the Assumption. I'm willing to grant all of it. It doesn't prove the truth of the proposition that you should take no thought for the morrow. The central doctrine of Jesus of Nazareth, take no thought for the morrow. No investment, no thrift, no care for your children, that you should abandon your family, not worry about construction, about investment, about anything. Just follow me. A ridiculous and immoral proposition that, as C.S. Lewis so cleverly, and I must say for him, very honestly puts it, means that the man must either have been a maniac, a sick man, an evil man, or he must have believed that the world was coming immediately to an end, and that he was commanded to announce this fact to the deluded Bronze Age inhabitants of Palestine. Because if he didn't believe that, and if he didn't believe he was divinely mandated, then his words would not have been inaccurate or false, they would have been wicked. That's what you have to be talking about. Now, there is, on the historicity point, there are only two reasons, I think, to suppose that there may have been the figure of some kind of deluded rabbi present at that time. The first is the fakery of the story. The fakery itself proves something. The prophecy says this man must be born in the house of David, of David's line in David's town. It means he must be born in Bethlehem. Jesus of Nazareth is well known to have been born in Nazareth. In order to get him to Bethlehem, a huge fabrication has to be undertaken. A census is proposed by Caesar Augustus. No such census ever took place. The people of the region were not required to go back to their hometown to be registered. That's never happened. Quirinius was not governor of Syria in that year, as the Gospels say. None of the story of the Nativity is true in any detail, and not one of the Gospels agrees with each other on this fabrication. But the fabrication itself suggests something. If they were simply going to make up the whole thing, and there'd never been any such person, then why not just have him born in Bethlehem right there and leave out the Nazarene business? So the very falsity of it, the very fanatical attempt to make it come right, suggests that, yes, there may have been a charismatic, deluded individual wandering around at that time. But which is most impressive to you? The fantastic fabrications, the unbelievably inane and inarticulate preachments, or the inconsistencies in the story? You could mention another thing about the resurrection. Most of the witnesses to this are women, illiterate, stupid, deluded, hysterical females, of the kind who in a Jewish court at that time would have had about as much chance of being listened to as they would in an Islamic court today. What religion that wants its fabrication to be believed is going to say, you've got to believe it, because we have some illiterate, hysterical girls who said they saw this? No, it's impressive to me. It's impressive to me that the evidence is so thin, and is so hysterical, and is so feeble, and is so obviously, strenuously cobbled together, because it suggests that something was going on. There was some character. And I don't want to, therefore, to profane those who think that no, that there must have been something, and say, no, there was nothing. This is not a whole cloth fabrication, but it is a very human and very intelligible and very pitiable, I think, practice of fraud that may have worked on stupefied peasants in the Greater Jerusalem area, but should really have no power to influence anyone in this room, whereas the noble methods and words and systems by which Socrates reasoned will continue to illuminate our path for as long as we care about the only real gift we have, which is our independent intelligence. Now, I think that'll do for now, but if you want to ask me, yes, I've run out of time, but if you would care just to look at the chapter I've written about the discovery, the concession now, by every Israeli archaeologist, by the whole school now of Israeli archaeology, that the entire story of the Exodus, the captivity, the wandering, the conquest of Canaan and the rest of it, is also a complete fabrication. You will see a perfect collision between the two things that do allow us to make progress as scholars and intellectuals, the weighing of evidence against interest, and that the great school of Jewish archaeology, given every motive to find the contrary, giving every motive and every chance in the Sinai and in the region to dig up and find what David Ben-Gurion, at the founding of the state, called the title deeds of Zionism, to come back empty-handed and say we admit it, this story has no basis of any kind whatever, is I submit to you, something far more noble, far more worthwhile, far more honest, far more courageous, far more moral, and far more Socratic than any of the nonsense that Dinesh just tried to pass off on you. Thanks.
All right. Dinesh is asked for 2 minutes to rebut Christopher, so then Christopher, I'll give you 2 minutes to rebut Dinesh, and then we'll go straight to questions.
Well, you notice when we were talking about Socrates, the question I was discussing was historicity. Do we know if there was, in fact, a Socrates? Christopher shifted ground, and he said, look, I don't care if there was or not. I'm concerned about his ideas. He shifted, you may say, from historical evidence to the value of his philosophy. But we weren't discussing the value of Socrates' philosophy. It would be a bit like if we were debating here, and I think you might have had a debate earlier, did Shakespeare write those plays? An historical question. You can say, well, we can enjoy Cymbeline without whether he did or not. That's a separate question. Either he wrote them or he didn't, and that's what history is aimed at investigating. Now, the Bible. Look, I want to argue here that when you look at this stuff, and I know earlier you debated Islam and so on, and it's very common in this situation to have people, usually secular guys, do something that is rather surprising of them, which is they behave exactly like, you might say, the most ignorant fundamentalist. And by that I mean they read the Bible in the most narrow, literal way they can. Now you might say, well, there are some Christians who do that. Yeah, but most of them are uneducated. The atheists who do it are well-educated and should know better. And so, for example, in looking at a passage in Scripture, or even in the Quran, the intelligent question isn't to ask, well, if I read it out loud and read nothing else, what will it say to me 2,000 years later? But rather, how have all the people who have followed with great seriousness this teaching for centuries understood and acted upon that passage? So, for example, I know it's fashionable even among conservatives. The Quran says, slay the infidels. Yeah, but we've had Islam for 1,300 years. We've had numerous Islamic empires, the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Ottomans in Turkey, the Mughal Empire in India, ruling over tens of millions of Hindus and Jews and Christians. Why aren't those people all dead? Because the Muslims didn't interpret that passage that way. No Muslim empire has wantonly killed all the infidels under its control. Why not? Couldn't they read the Quran? They did, but they read it a different way. Now, Jesus, I just want to make one point because this is really not the subject of our debate, but C.S. Lewis, I believe, once noted that there are just a couple of people in history that when you read about them, if they walked into the room right now, we would all instantly recognize them. He said one such person is Samuel Johnson, that Boswell's account is so vivid that if Samuel Johnson walked in right here, we'd know right away it's Johnson. And I would submit that's also true of Jesus. Jesus is actually not only more real, but in some ways his sayings are more memorable, more powerful than any single character in Shakespeare. Can you name a single character in Shakespeare who utters as powerfully aphoristic, memorable, and influencing statements as Christ? You can't. So here's the point. Either Christ was made up by a bunch of illiterates who apparently were unknown Shakespeares of their own time, creating a character more memorable than Hamlet, or, as Albert Einstein himself said, he said, this man of the gospel so pulsates with life that nobody who really encounters him in an open-minded, unprejudiced way will deny that there was such a man walking around. Now, you may not believe him, but it's not that difficult to believe that he existed.
Okay, so it goes on getting worse. First, Dinesh says, people like me who will say that Jesus didn't maybe exist will never concede that, say, Socrates didn't. I produce my own book. I say that this is the first concession I make, but it doesn't matter because we don't say of Socrates that he had miraculous powers, that if you don't believe in what he said, you'll go to hell or heaven and so forth. There's no shift here, Dinesh, at all on my part of any kind. As to the historicity of it, or the reality of it, let's take something that for some reason Christians think is important, which I conceded. I said it could have been true, it wouldn't make any difference to me, the virgin birth. According to the Bible, the birth of Jesus Christ was in this wise. I quote, when his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. I add in my book, and I'll quote, yes. And the Greek demigod Perseus was born when the god Jupiter visited the virgin Danae as a shower of gold and got her with child. The god Buddha was born through an opening in his mother's flank. Catlicus, the serpent-skirted, caught a little ball of feathers from the sky and hid it in her bosom. And the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli was thus conceived. The virgin Nana took a pomegranate from the tree watered by the blood of the slain Agdestris and laid it in her bosom and gave birth to the god Attis. The virgin daughter of a Mongol king awoke one night and found herself bathed in a great light, which caused her to give birth to Genghis Khan. Krishna was born of the virgin Devaka. Horus was born of the virgin Isis. Mercury was born of the virgin Maya. Romulus was born of the virgin Rhea Silvia. Even the Quran agrees that the Virgin Mary was born by an immaculate conception. By the way, the Quran says that Jesus was not crucified at all. The Jews crucified someone else in his place, and he never died. There's no end to the way in which this kind of thing can be fabricated, but those who say that you can just tell by the potency and pungency of the story, by the memorability of it, that there must be something true about it, are simply inviting you to rely not on your thinking faculties or your intellectual capacity at all, but on straight-out credulity and on the repeated manufacture of things that appear to be part of the hard and soft wiring of legend in our mammalian primate history. Apparently, if you want to have a prophet, it's better if his mother is a virgin. You want to fabricate another one, that's what will happen. Actually, Joseph Smith, as far as I know, never made that claim. But I think Mrs. Smith was well enough known to the local newspaper reporters of the greater New York area, in which you can read up the whole history of that family, to make it rather unlikely that thing could be sold. Now, here's what Lewis actually does say, and because I'm not going to, I take so few occasions to praise C.S. Lewis, and let alone to defend him against Dinesh, that I'm going to insist on doing it properly. Here is what Lewis says. The alternative he gives you is not that of authenticity or otherwise, a Johnsonian, a Boswellian test at all. He says, if Jesus claims to be able to take your sins on himself, remember what we're talking about here, the to me revolting idea of human sacrifice, of vicarious redemption, of scapegoating, the idea that you can throw your sin on someone else and make him die and take your sin with him. The repulsive, immoral idea of vicarious redemption. I can pay your debt, brother, sister. I can. I will if I can. I could serve your sentence in prison if I was brave enough, or if it was allowed to me. Maybe. But I cannot take your responsibility from you, because it would be immoral to do so. You have no right to ask it of me. You can't shed that responsibility. The whole basis of morality requires that you face it and take it upon yourself. Nonetheless, Christianity offers the repulsive idea of vicarious redemption, and Lewis faces it, and this is what he says. He says, now, unless the speaker who offers that is God, this is really so preposterous as to be comic. We can all understand how a man forgives offenses against himself. You tread on my toes, I forgive you. You steal my money, I forgive you. But what should we make of a man, himself unrobbed and untrodden upon, who announced that he forgave you for treading on other men's toes and stealing other men's money? Asinine fatuity is the kindest description we should give of his conduct. This is Lewis. Yet this is what Jesus did. He told people their sins were forgiven and never waited to consult the other people whom their sins had injured. He unhesitatingly behaved as if he was the party chiefly concerned, the person chiefly offended in all offenses. This makes sense only if he really was the God whose laws are broken and whose love is wounded in every sin. In the mouth of any speaker who is not God, these words would imply what I can only regard as a silliness and conceit, unrivaled by any other character in history. To people like Thomas Jefferson, a hero of mine, who said that Jesus wasn't divine but he was a great moral teacher, Lewis quite properly spoke with scorn and said, that's the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman and something worse. And Lewis, who's argued so well up till then, can't complete a syllogism. Poor guy, he never quite could do that. He said, since I don't think he was the devil of hell, I have to conclude he was the Son of God. Well, you don't have to follow the paltry logic of that to see that at least Lewis is not making it easy on himself. And that to prove that this deluded individual did actually exist, if it could be proven, which it cannot, would leave you as a Christian with all your work still ahead of you. And you'd still have to face my objection, brilliantly phrased by Lewis, that the teachings of Christianity, from vicarious redemption to the love of enemies, no thought for the morrow need be taken, that no thrift or care or family or society or solidarity is necessary, that these are immoral teachings that have done and continue to inflict untold moral and physical harm on our species. And until we outgrow this nonsense, we have no chance of emancipating ourselves.
Okay. We're running out of time. We'll start the questions. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Moderator. My name is Patrick Boylan, and I'm an Irish Catholic Jew, if there ever is such a thing, who was born in a Muslim country, and I've listened to both Mr. D'Souza and Mr. Hitchens. I agree quite a bit with Mr. Hitchens. Mr. D'Souza, my question is to you. By the way, Moderator, am I allowed to go for the throat? Because that's my favorite move here. No? Okay. Anyway, Mr. D'Souza, I know you were born in India, and you're Goan and everything else, and you've lived in a Hindu country. It surprises me that you don't know that the Muslims killed over 70 million Hindus in India when Muhammad bin Qasim came, in the 7th century, 7010 actually it was, 710 actually. They killed over 70 million Hindus. It surprises me when you talk about Judeo-Christianity and you talk about the Inquisitions and you don't mention a single thing about the razzias that the Islamic people took out against the Christians and Jews and murdered them left, right, and center. You don't talk about that. They did it not in the name of Islam, but because it is taught to them to do it in Islam. And I know you're going to say, well, you take it out of context, it's cherry picking, it's blah, blah, blah. The biggest threat we have right now, and I'll come back to terrorism, which is my forte, the biggest threat we have right now is religion, sir. And it is the Islamic religion. Osama bin Laden has said he has permission to kill from 5 to 10 million people. Okay. He has got the fatwa.
Okay.
One sec, let me just finish this. In the Quran, 47:4, when you meet the unbelievers, strike at their necks, take captives, and bind them firmly.
We don't have time. We don't have time to go on. Dinesh, do you want to just take a quick stab at that?
Yeah, the question is, why do you think that religion is not the cause of all these problems? Especially as far as Islam is concerned.
Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
How many people were killed by the Roman Empire?
What's that got to do with Muslims killing all the Hindus in India?
I thought you would be confused because
No, I'm not confused.
we have had
I know
a number of empires through history. Most of them have left an ocean of blood and a mountain of bodies. I'm sure when Genghis Khan stormed across the plains of Asia, he wasn't handing out bowls of Mongolian beef. And yet, as far as I know, he didn't do it in the name of religion, did he? So the question we have to ask is not, did the Muslims do this? But in what way were the Islamic empires radically different from other empires of other religions or even secular empires that have littered our sad world? I don't see any fundamental difference of behavior. In fact, in some respects, Islamic empires were more tolerant than other empires.
That's a lie, sir.
Excuse me?
That is a lie, and you know it.
That is
Okay,
a
no,
lie.
okay, no,
Well,
no,
I don't know
sir,
it to be a
sir,
lie.
okay, no, we can't get into that. All right, let's go on to the next question.
Well, can I?
Yeah, okay, all right, go ahead, Christopher.
Maybe the question wasn't me, but first, Dinesh is quite right in saying that many Muslim empires have been, especially the late Ottoman and to some extent the Abbasid caliphates, were models of tolerance compared to many Christian and non-religious empires. So you should withdraw your progress suggestion that he was being untruthful there. I don't personally think the body count is the thing that decides this. I wish, for example, that the Roman Empire had succeeded in putting down the Jewish rebellion in Palestine. I think we'd all be very much better off if the Jewish zealots had been obliterated and their horrible monotheism and its intolerance prevented from mutating into Christianity. I think the only chance for civilization in Palestine at that time was a continuation of what Alexander the Great, who by the way is a figure in history, had brought to the area, a kind of Hellenism which was actually extremely attractive to many Jews and remains the model for secular and reform Judaism. That's what I happen to think. I don't think all imperialisms are totalitarian. What I think I hope I've tried to carry this point, and I'll just seize this chance to underline it again. Never mind the body count, think of the principle. The principle of monotheistic religion is totalitarian to begin with. It says that you must submit to an authority that cannot be challenged, that owns you body and soul, that can watch you while you sleep and after you're dead, that can convict you of thought crime for what you may do in your dreams, that abolishes the whole concept of human individuality, responsibility and autonomy, and forces you to love a dictator who you also fear. That is what is wicked. And it would be perfectly all right to kill in the name of resisting that. So the body count that it naturally inflicts by imposing itself is a second-order consideration.
Well, let's just look at Christianity for just a moment, because the central principle of Christianity, and Judaism too, if you go back to the first book of Genesis, is that God made man free to choose. Very often when I debate this issue, people say, well, why would a just God allow the Holocaust? How come all these evils exist in the world? And the short answer is because God made man free, including free to reject him. So, far from there being a totalitarian principle, which, by the way, if God exists, he could have imposed. Christianity is based on the idea that you have the freedom even to say no to God. And a lot of moral evil in the world can be explained in that way, that God could intervene and usurp that freedom, in which case there would be perhaps an obliteration of all human-inflicted evil, but then we would be robots. So the very fact that here we are free individuals walking about, free to accept a church or not, free to believe or not, these things came out of Christianity. So it's not right to say, to take secular despotisms of the 20th century, which arose out of a rebellion against religion, and anachronistically superimpose them backward through history, as if they were the creation of religion itself. This is the huge historical sleight of hand to which I'm afraid we are being subjected.
You see how totalitarianism, you see how the habits of totalitarian thought will rot a brain even as fine as that of my friend Dinesh. He says to you, be grateful to Big Brother, be grateful to Big Brother. He's allowed you the right to dissent. Who in this room does not feel insulted by something as fatuous as that. And by the way, whatever, and contemptible as that, by the way, whatever the definition of free will may be, and I say we have it because we have no choice but to have it, it is not something you can be given. If you tell me it's free will and you've been given it, you abolish the category in which you are dealing. Surely that must be plain. And no, you do not have the right to say that there is no God, and that his prophet and his son are not valid, and their teachings are not to be listened to. You only have that right if you're willing to risk your immortal soul and an infinity of torment. And to say that this is a kindness is to be an abject person, sprawling at the feet of a man-made idol. Don't do it. Get up on your feet, raise yourself to your full height, throw off this shackle. It's a mind-forged manacle.
Okay.
If the laws of physics are completely deterministic, in other words, if we live in a universe that's purely physical and driven by physical laws, it's very difficult to see where free will comes from. If we are evolved primates and in a certain profound way indistinguishable or on a natural continuum from other creatures that are the product of instinct and natural forces, not having the will to say, this is not right, or I shouldn't have done that. You can never say of a stone, you shouldn't have rolled down the hill. You can never say to a cheetah, you shouldn't have run after that rabbit. So we human beings, there's a certain little bit of an ontological leap here. We're assuming within ourselves a capacity possessed by no other object in the universe. What is the source of this? That's worth at least a moment's reflection.
Okay, next question, please.
Actually, it was Milton Friedman, not God, who made us free to choose. Mr. D'Souza, in a recent essay, you held what you call Darwinism responsible for such evils as the eugenics movement of the 20th century, genocide, and so forth. Could you articulate for us your position on evolution, on intelligent design's so-called theory? And do you believe that wide embrace of the fact of evolution necessarily leads to the moral decay of society?
Well, my position is very simply this. I think that there is a lot of evidence for biological evolution. I defend the idea of evolution in my book. I distinguish the scientific facts about evolution with something I call metaphysical Darwinism. If you read Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, you see that they're not just talking about the transition from life form A to life form B. Evolution, I think, is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go nearly as far as these guys claim. To give you one simple example, at one point, Dawkins speculates on the possibility of the fact that we may live not in one universe, but in an infinity of universes. Then raising the question of how some universes survive. And he thinks that that could be by Darwinian evolution. In other words, natural competition among universes, in which some universes make it and others don't. Well, we are going a little far afield from what the biologists have been able to show on the ground and through the facts of physical science. When the evolutionist purports to explain everything from why men don't like to eat vegetables to why women like to ask for directions, simply by saying, hey, evolution explains it. At one point, in fact, you have contradictory explanations being given by the same set of facts. So at one point, to give you an example, Dawkins, he's talking about why the peacock likes to show its feathers. This would seem to be evolutionary, from an evolutionary point of view, a problem. Because in displaying the feathers, the peacock attracts predators that are more likely to eat the peacock. But Dawkins says, well, but maybe there is an evolutionary explanation. Maybe the peacock is trying to show off to Mrs. Peacock. So if the peacock has no feathers, hey, we can explain that by Darwin, because if it had feathers, the predator would eat it. But if the peacock has feathers, hey, Darwin comes in to explain that too, because it's a show-off mechanism to Mrs. Peacock. This is called using the same facts. You essentially have an unscientific application of Darwinism here, because there is no possibility of challenging or refuting such a theory. If a theory can be used to explain contradictory facts, and I cite Dawkins in my book saying, even if there was no evidence for evolution, we should still take it to be true. This kind of stuff, I think, would embarrass even a religious believer. Because even the religious believer doesn't say that even if God didn't exist, we should still believe in him. Even the religious believer can entertain the possibility that God may not exist, and in fact struggles with that many times. So, I distinguish evolution, the scientific theory, which I believe in, from metaphysical Darwinism, which I see as an ideological masquerade for atheism. It is an effort to try to put an atheist spin on evolutionary theory and to claim for evolution far more than it actually explains.
Next question, please.
At first, this debate wasn't about whether religion was either, true or false, but whether it was a help or hindrance. So I'm wondering, why do you consider writings about not to lie and steal and murder, and that you should be nice to other people and you should respect them, bad?
Who's your question for?
Well, the first account that I know of, what we commonly call the Golden Rule, was do to others as you wish them to do to you, or rather, as it's sometimes phrased, was in fact phrased by the Babylonian rabbi, repulsive in front of you. Though it has a huge element of tautology in it, it comes from the analects of Confucius. Some people say Confucianism is a religion, some say not.
They say it's really ready.
I would say it isn't. Certainly monotheistic one. It certainly well predates any monotheism we know about. What we don't have is any evidence of any human society where theft, perjury, murder, incest, and so forth were condoned. It seems very improbable that such a society would have survived to tell the tale. And indeed, with certain prohibitions that most people don't need to have reinforced, such as cannibalism and incest, as a matter of evolution by natural selection, that powerful, if I agree with Dinesh, somewhat overrated force, will make sure that the tribe dies out in any case. So there's no chance of that transgression going unpunished, whether you believe in the supernatural or otherwise. What I object to in the insinuation of your remark is that we wouldn't know these things, you and I, we don't know each other, but that you and I couldn't be relied upon to tell a wrong action from a right one, or a moral action from an immoral one, without supernatural permission. I have no idea what makes you think that there's anything to that proposition, or why you'd want people to be so abject and so contemptible that without being told this by witch doctors, or instructed by the heavens, or by earthquakes or fires or floods, that they wouldn't be able to derive it from their own experience of human solidarity, which is certainly how I found it out, which requires no underpinning from priests, rabbis, or mullahs.
You look like someone who must get in the last word.
Well, I think the argument about morality is not the fact that we couldn't be good without God. But think about it this way. If moral rules are universal, then that is something very odd. Because if we are evolved primates, driven by an impulse to survive and reproduce, it is conceivable that one group or another might have, through some set of accidents, come up with a set of rules that cut in the other direction. Think about the essence of morality. It is to militate against self-interest. If morality were congruent with self-interest, we wouldn't need it. Nobody needs to tell you to go out and make money. There's a natural drive telling you to do that. No one has to tell you to be powerful, to seek what you want. Morality is the voice that tells you against what you want to do. You're walking on the riverbank, you hear, help, 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 I'm drowning. You're not a very good swimmer. Your natural instinct is to keep going. That guy is nothing to you. It's not your brother, it's not your wife, it's a stranger. But the little voice in your head turns on and says, you should try to help. At least put out a stick. Now what I ask is, where does this voice that has no Darwinian explanation whatsoever, call it the voice of pure altruism, it cannot be explained by reciprocal advantage or genetic kinship or any other of the elaborate theories.
Animals do it. Animals do it.
Well, if animals do it, that's interesting in its own right, but it doesn't mean that there's a Darwinian explanation that's been given. You've simply extended the problem further.
Okay, with that, with that, we must, I'm sorry.
Primates do it, many other mammals.
Yeah.
For the obvious reason, for the survival of the
Okay.
species.
We must call this part of it to an end. I'm going to make a couple of requests. Let's give these gentlemen an incredible round of applause. Oh, okay, they are supposed to vote. I'm told you're supposed to vote on who won the debate. This, I think there was some deal about the winner gets all of the honoraria or something like that. I'm not real sure. But okay, very quickly, if you have your blue paddles, great. If you only have your hands up, who thinks Christopher Hitchens won the debate? Okay, all right, hands down. Let's get an objective opinion here, Alec. I'm going to need your help on this. Dinesh D'Souza won the debate. Well, yelling doesn't count. Yelling doesn't help, but I think by a slight margin we will give it to Dinesh.
But it doesn't matter. How did people start out?
Yeah, we don't know that. Okay.
That's what matters.
Okay.